1. As we have mentioned before, we have now an interesting and we have our main interview. We are with Dr. Nicholas Brown. He's a researcher at Linnaeus University in Sweden. Dr. Nicholas, thank you so much. We are so happy to be here with you. And thank you, obviously, for your time.
Gracias por la invitación.
Thank you very much, Doctor. As a general comment, remember what one famous philosopher, Greek philosopher indeed, Aristotle, mentioned, that one of the main goals for human being is to achieve happiness. Although it is not an easy task to measure subjective well-being, there are alternative ways and theoretical definitions to define what happiness is and what happiness is not. Additionally, we will discuss a framework for conceptualizing the various factors that influence well-being, which sparks ongoing debates regarding its applicability, validity, and practical implications. Furthermore, we will inquire whether the explanatory factors of happiness are independent or interconnected. You know that part of our mission is to communicate relevant research to our audience. So in this way, we want to ask the first question to our international guest in terms of what is the relevance of studying well-being or happiness? Dr. Nicholas?
Well, psychologists traditionally studied people who were not very well. And perhaps, so the focus of psychology, since its invention, and certainly since the Second World War, has been very much curing mental illness, understanding pathological behaviors. And a group of psychologists thought it might be better or useful to find out why some people who are not depressed, who are not bad people or suffering, are happier than others. I think it's a legitimate question. Whether it's a question that you can answer with science, I think is a difficult one, and whether perhaps you can identify factors that lead to happiness, but that doesn't mean that they are causal, and it doesn't mean that you can necessarily change your life to become happier. I think that's the second level question. So the first level is, can we measure it? Can we measure happiness? Is that useful to know? And then what are we going to do about it when we discover that some people are happier than others? How are we going to, what can we do with that? Can we do anything with that? I think is the interesting question.
So in that sense, from the psychological perspective, can we say, for example, that happiness is the opposite of depression or being depressed? Or perhaps there is no agreement on this issue? And perhaps how is it possible to measure subjective well-being or happiness?
Well, to measure it, you basically have to ask people how happy they are. So about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, we had the publication of the annual World Happiness Survey, which always generates footage and column inches and discussions, and everyone looks to see where their country is and did it go up or down since last year. And this asks people one question, just one question. You go up to people and you say, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is the worst possible life you could have and 10 is the best possible life you could have, where are you? And they ask that one question of a large number of people in various countries. And then they produce a report on it. And then people attempt to analyze it and attempt to understand whether it means anything. And Finland or Denmark usually comes out top. And then Sweden, Netherlands, and other countries come at various points lower down. And then we try and say, well, is this just economics? Is it due to social structures? Is there something about the people themselves, about the culture? So it generates endless discussion. But the way they measure it Very, very simple. They ask people one question on a scale of 0 to 10. In response to your earlier question, is happiness the opposite of depression? I guess depressed people are clearly not happy, but I don't think it's a simple linear scale that goes from kind of -10 to +10. There are, I think, many complex aspects to it. And depressed people are not happy, but not all people who are not particularly happy are depressed. So that's a much more complex question. Now, whether asking people how satisfied they are with their lives, which is what this question does, that would be life satisfaction. And the psychologists you can have entire conferences about the difference between happiness, subjective well-being, and life satisfaction. And one of the constant themes of psychology is measurement. What are we measuring? How well can we measure it? And how can we distinguish it from the other things that we might want to measure? And these debates can get very complicated.
Okay, great, doctor. You have conducted a research with analogy, for example, comparing happiness to a pie. Why did you use that analogy?
No, I didn't do that. That was what somebody else did. I critiqued that. So there was an article from 2005, which is very influential in the area of what is called positive psychology, which is a recent creation of a sort of umbrella under which we bring many aspects of the study of well-being and happiness. And the claim in this article was that there was a substantial percentage of an individual's personal happiness that they could change themselves, because we know that a lot about how happy a person is to do with the circumstances they live in. We know that a lot of it is to do with their genetic makeup. You know people who are not very happy people, and they're the children of sometimes not very happy people. There's an inherited component. The claim of this book was that up to 40% of an individual's happiness is something that they can change themselves. And this came out in a popular book a couple of years later. And on the front cover of that book, they decided to illustrate the 40% with a picture of a pie. And there was a chunk cut out of it, which was 40%. So this became known as the happiness pie. And obviously, most people like pie. So this was a kind of positive thing to have. And so in about 12, 13 years later, my co-author, Julia Rohrer, and I wrote a critique of this model in which we suggested that this amount that can be of your well-being that can be controlled by an individual by changing by choosing to do various activities, for example, is probably a lot less than 40%.
So in that terms, we can say that in terms of, for example, applicability, validity, or practical implication, is not true that these perhaps these measures of the pie of happiness are always true, in your opinion?
I think the claims that were made in that article and in that subsequent book are rather overambitious. They did not sufficiently take into account the effect of particularly the circumstances of people's lives on their happiness. The example that I like to give, because I wrote this a few years ago and there are more recent examples, but if you look at the country of Greece, for example, in 2005 on the World Happiness Survey, people in Greece were scoring an average, I think, of 6.3 out of 10. And in 2014, they were scoring 4.8. And during that time, Greece went through an unprecedented financial and economic crisis. And people's happiness scores dropped. I think the difference is 23%. The original claim had been that from the authors of the happiness pie that only 10% of your circumstances was due to, of your happiness was due to circumstances. And here were people whose, country's economy was ruined and they went down 23%. So it didn't seem sensible. It didn't seem realistic to say that only 10% of your happiness is due to circumstances. So we went and dug into where these numbers came from, and we found a number of errors in that. So probably there's only, we don't have a figure, but it's a lot less than 40% of your happiness that you can consciously affect without making any changes to your circumstances, without becoming richer or getting married, just on, programs that you can decide to do, going jogging or learning a musical instrument, something like that. These are always going to be, I think, quite minor things.
Okay, in that point, for example, if you mentioned that perhaps the richest countries in the world are with the highest level of happiness. For example, you mentioned some countries of them. In that case, for example, what other potential determinants of happiness could be considered? For example, circumstance is one.
Well, so the
Yes.
breakdown is into circumstances, the genetic component, and then everything else. And another critique I think we had of the model is, first of all, the measure of circumstances was only evaluated among Americans. So, for example, living in a democracy was not variable between these people because they all lived in the United States. Having clean drinking water was not a consideration. Whereas when you go on an international level, those are factors that have to be included under the circumstances of your life. The other naive thing about the model is it basically took 100 and then subtracted the genetic component and subtracted the circumstances. But depending on what labels you want to put on things, not everything else comes under activities that you choose to do. So there's all kinds of problems of definition that come into it. But within the things that affect you in terms of your circumstances, yeah, whether your country is at war, whether there's famine, whether you have a degree of political freedom, and clearly the 20 or 30 richest countries in the world are going to score higher on most of those things because freedom tends to go along with wealth. We know that. We know that from every study that's ever been done. There are very few rich countries where people are not free. Perhaps the petrostates of the Middle East a little bit. But apart from that, people are happier when they can express themselves freely, and being able to do that also goes along with the entrepreneurship that you need to create wealth in an economy.
Thank you, Doctor. And according to your last research in terms of happiness, well-being, what are the main findings or the main discussions that you want to address in terms of these factors related with happiness?
I'm not really a researcher into the specific determinants of happiness. I personally think that trying to make yourself happier is one of the best ways to make yourself less happy. I think happiness is something that emerges from living a good life for whatever other reasons that you decide to do that. And for some people, it will be the pursuit of pleasure and getting themselves a boat and going out on that boat every weekend. And for some people, it will be throwing themselves into social causes. But I think it's doing things that are congruent with your philosophy and your beliefs is you're likely to wake up one morning and realize that you're happy. Whereas trying to study happiness or to achieve happiness for its own sake I think is probably on its own one of the worst things you can do. And there seems to be some research along these lines too, that trying to make yourself happier just not only won't work, but you'll probably get very neurotic about it. Why am I not happy? I filled in the questionnaire last week. I want to get another 2 points next week. I'd better go jogging or eat a cream cake or whatever it is. And you can't look at it in those terms. So you then get the interesting problem of how to measure these things in a way where people are sincere, and yet we're asking people questions. When you ask people a question, they don't always answer honestly because they might want to please you, they might want to please themselves, they might like to pretend that things are a little bit better than they are. And so it's very, very, very hard. This is one of the hardest questions. This is one of the hardest questions to answer scientifically. And I don't think we currently have the means to do it. And perhaps one day we will all have a little USB port on the back of our heads, and someone will be able to plug in like a thermometer, but a happiness meter, and see how happy you are. But for the moment, we just have to ask people. And as we know, we're all human and we can all choose how we answer.
You know that perhaps for government or for public policy, it's very important to establish some policies or indicators. For example, economists, they always are interested in what is in the growth of the economy. For example, some indicators like the gross domestic product, the GDP. And for example, what do you think about if we have other or some indicators related to happiness, for example, measuring in what sense our country is growing, perhaps in terms of happiness, it could be possible. And perhaps one interesting question, another interesting question is, how can public policy create opportunities for happiness?
Well, other than by making people better off, or making the country freer, or giving people access to better healthcare or better education, I wonder if there is anything separate that you can do to otherwise sprinkle happiness on top of that. And I really don't think so. If, as we've seen with the World Happiness Survey, the countries that come out top are the ones that are the richest and the freest. And people sometimes, when it comes out, the top 10 always get published, and people say, oh, my country isn't in the top 10, therefore we are terrible. But the United States is usually 13th or 14th. The UK is 15th or 16th. I'm afraid I don't know where Bolivia comes. But it doesn't really matter as long as you're roughly the same place you were last year. Because if you want your country to go up 10 places, you've somehow got the other countries to go down, and they're also doing what they can for their citizens. So the World Happiness Index is not a very good measure of that. In terms of the score on that, yeah, maybe 10 years ago, people said 6, and now they say 6.3. That's probably the best you're going to get. That's probably the best you're going to get because the majority of how people feel about their lives is dictated by, do they have a job? Do they feel valued? Is their society safe and free? And I don't think there's very much you can do otherwise to change that. And if you look at countries that have had a minister of happiness, I'm not sure that they're always the best countries to be doing that. Several countries have had a minister of happiness, and they also have Amnesty International writing reports about them. And so it's quite possible, I think, to have this idea, oh, we'll make people happier, but we're doing it by telling them to be happy. We're doing it through propaganda. And if you just put in place the things that will make people's lives objectively better, I think they'll become happier pretty much on their own, collectively. Individually, things are a little bit different. But at the level of a government, we don't talk, the government is not interested in any particular individual. But the best way a government, I think, can improve the happiness of its citizens overall is to be more free, to be, more encouraging of economic development, and to provide people with the services they need. I think, ask anyone who lives in Finland or Denmark what they like about their country, and look at that.
Thank you, Doctor. Well, the time for this interview was really short. I had many further questions, but I want to end to finish our interview, perhaps for this research area. I don't know in your opinion, what are the agenda and future research needs regarding happiness, for example, as a pie, or perhaps if we have another potential area that we need to have more research?
I personally am interested in where the relationship between happiness and GDP is not as obvious as it might seem. So I'm interested in countries which are scoring 15 and 20 places higher on the World Happiness Index than they might on an index of either GDP or some other, health system ranking or something like that. I'm sure there will be countries that are like that and that are consistently like that. But then you have to say, is it because the people are happier, or is it because there's something in the culture about how they answer questions about happiness? Perhaps when you go to people in a country that values, excuse me, perhaps if you go to people in a country that values outgoingness, and you say, how well is your life going? They may say 10 because it's part of the way that you present yourself within that culture, even though they're actually no happier than the people in the next country, which doesn't encourage you to go, woo, 10, and sort of be a bit more modest and say 8. Maybe those people are equally happy. They just have different ways of expressing it. But that would be a starting point, would be to find the countries that appear to be happier than their economic circumstances would predict, and then dig into that and say, is it that these people are happier, or is it a cultural factor? I was reading the other day about Spain, where I live. Spain doesn't come particularly high on the happiness index. It's a wealthy country. It doesn't do too badly. But Spain scores quite low on depression, for example. If you give people measures of depression, the average, most people in most countries are not depressed, but the score that people have for depressive symptoms in Spain is quite low. And so maybe they don't say that they're super happy, but on the other hand, maybe they're less depressed. And those kind of questions, I think, are interesting, because we have a much better handle on depression. We can describe depression, I think, much better than we can describe happiness. And so those kind of questions interest me, is how can we separate happiness out from all of the other stuff that we know makes people say that they're happier, which is the freedom and the economic development and the healthcare and that kind of thing. So I think that would be my thing to look at.
Dr. Nicholas, thanks again. I really appreciate all of your comments and significant contributions. Please, I kindly invite you for another conversation again for the near future.
Thank you very much.
This was our main conversation in this session, considering the analogy of happiness as a pie. Now we go to our institutional announcement, and then we'll continue with our program. We have more coming up.